So, greetings, friends. We're still reading Sloterdijk's analysis of our current time, and he wants to develop a so-called third critique. Why is it a third critique? A third critique of postmodern or modern society? It is a third critique because first we had the critique of Marx, then the critique of the Frankfurt School, and he thinks there is something fundamentally wrong with it, and now he wants to develop a third critique. And for that, he criticizes actually Marx, that his idea of capitalism does not hit the mark of identifying the real problem that we have as human beings. So Marx had an idea of something that is called the first accumulation, which we will probably discuss a little later, but Sloterdijk thinks it's mobilization. So let's talk about this mobilization again by looking at the text. So again, why the term mobilization? It is a military term, and Sloterdijk says that this term will keep alive the memory of the violent core of the major scientific, military, and industrial processes, especially at a time when they are entering a smart phase where violence is becoming informational, cool, procedural, and analgesic. I don't know that word. So the term of mobilization stands still in the tradition of the military complexes, but of course we don't have that so much anymore in 1989. Instead, we have now a so-called smart phase where violence is transformed and operates on the level of informational technology, is cool and procedural. So we have here a transfer of the main meanings of that term from the heavy industry to fast information, and we are transitioning from working society to learning society. See, and this may be also a point, like even for a changed Marxist system, this will still work when we don't have working classes anymore, but creative workers. So what is the core idea of the civilizing mechanism? It exploits all modern growth of skill, knowledge, mobility, precision, and effectiveness for processes of crowding out and killing off for upgrades, expansions, self-authorizations. So if we look at our current time, it's just an increase in efficiency on all possible levels that Sloterdijk criticizes here. And he goes on, mobilization as an autogenous fundamental process of modernity leads to the provision of ever-increasing movement potentials for position holdings. So we increase all potentials. And what's the goal of this increase? Further increase. Which precisely by way of the conditions and effects of this deployment make themselves impossible as position and drifts into the unattainable. So, of course, there is a limit to this, what Ray Kurzweil also says, the infinite growth of a transhumanist society. So it is here that the broad field of kinetic paradoxes opens up for an alternative critique of modernity. So we have already read that before. He talks here about a third version of a critical theory, and he wants to distinguish a correct movement from a false mobilization. A critical theory of mobilization would bridge the gap between the thought process and the actual event on the level of basic terms. There would no longer be any outside thinking. The theorist would have to ask herself at every sentence whether what she is doing increases the offering to the idol of mobilization or distinctly subtracts from it. So a critic always has to be, in the first instance, a critic of himself. That is what I feel Sloterdijk says here, and I think that's a very helpful idea, because only then the critic really constantly asks himself if his suggestions are really meaningful. And see, I mean, my point of view is it's always easy to criticize something, but the question is if the critique is really genuine, necessary at that moment, and if considering its global side effects will really make it better. So, and he says that the former critical semantics if they abandon the kinetic complexity with the movement of the word process, they will go into the worst of possible directions, which maybe we have seen in the form of Marxism. Now, that is not that he has something against Marxism in principle. He just sees a major problem with it neglecting the mobilization aspect. It is not about a question of the justice in the society in the first place, but a question of how we create a preschool of demobilization. And this theory has to be a quiet theory of loud mobilization that can criticize this from a quiet standpoint. And he also says the problem of such a theory is that it cannot generate its own beginning. He brings that to the catchphrase that the more modern, the more postmodern. So in a sense, we have to passively go through the development of modernity to really see its impact. And then within modernity, we maybe can formulate the postmodern ideas. There is no absolute standpoint in that sense anymore. It's just reacting to whatever is modern. It must have entered the modern scuffle without reservation. Otherwise, it would never arrive on the flip side of things. That's what I just said, right? We need to go into these processes. But then the question is, well, what's the true way out of this? And here he uses a nice word, tempodrome. So how does this third theory find itself in the quiet of the eye of the storm? This is an interesting phrase. We get closer to an epistemological abyss where theory without wisdom is no longer useful, even as a theory. So now, of course, the question is, what is this wisdom? What makes this theory so much better? And so he wants to now sketch or outline a critique of political kinetics. But of course, he has to reflect on the difficulties of such a critique. And he asks, quite reasonably, why not go with Marxism? Okay, Marxist successors were of the partially justified opinion that they made the causes of modern radical changes in the world transparent with their analysis of capital flow. So Marx just focuses on capital flow and makes the problems of the world apparent by that. They formulated a revolutionary ethics that saw the strategic core of its practice in the political control over capital. So their idea of human emancipation, as we can see, is directed towards control of whatever produces, and then, however, still produce limitlessly. Thus, the fathers of socialism openly placed their bets on an ethics of productive mobilization with a humanist intent. And I think Sloterdijk is very critical if this human intent can drive this sort of mobilization, or whether that is just a problematic idea in itself. Nevertheless, Marxist theories present themselves as being without alternative because they say we either have socialism or barbarism. But what Sloterdijk criticizes, and I said that already, is that the problem was really that they had an inadequate concept of the modern kinetics of world change. And they were analyzing the first situation that was called, I have that here actually, the primitive accumulation phase. That's already a mistake, as Sloterdijk says. I have that here. It's another video. Maybe we have some time to go into it. But let's first read a little bit more of what Sloterdijk has to say here. So we have a secondary movement that is determined in the last instance by the economic primary movement. This primary movement has exhibited a special legality since the 18th century, the age of the Industrial Revolution. Since people's action have been largely understood as material reproductions of their lives, in the capital process, a categorically new phenomenon has emerged that no other age had to contend with, the phenomenon of work as such, the category of work sans phrase. So yeah, the sans phrase, it means that there's only work as such. And we see before we had work as the material reproduction of humans' lives. So for example, they produced bread in order to eat it. Now in capitalism, when you're a baker in one of these major cities or anywhere, you produce bread not to give it to yourself, not to give it to your family, but to sell hundreds, thousands of breads to people up to a point where you may not even want to eat bread anymore because you just have seen too much of it. And I think this is what Marx calls the primitive accumulation phase, and we maybe want to look into an explanation of this from this video very briefly.
For him, the vital condition for the first accumulation to happen is separating the people from the means of production.
Okay, so we separate the people from the way of how they produce. Let me just readjust the picture here a bit so that we can see everything. Okay, let's go on.
Why would our Tom work for you if he has everything necessary for his living? He wouldn't. So, the first step was to deprive the people from their land. They lost not only their homes, but also their fields, or their way of making a living. Now, they needed to buy food and homes, which was even better for the capitalists. As for how was it done, Marx put it simply: stealing, lying, and bribes. So now the people needed to work for the capitalists in order to survive. But the science and technology has a fast development under the pressure of capital.
So this is the basic idea. I will link this video by the which is called The Easy Way. Nevertheless, Sloterdijk thinks maybe this idea is a bit too simple. I mean, we see that they say, okay, the capitalist was stealing, lying, and bribing. And certainly these phenomena occurred, but was it like the goal to deprive the people of their land? Yes, of course, that individual person for sure. But the larger phenomenon of capitalism, according to Sloterdijk, is driven by larger forces. But human activity only becomes work as such if it belongs to a form of production which in its very essence continually produces further possibilities of production. So, and here Sloterdijk sees the anthropological motive of self-production combined with the economic motive of profit and the agonal motive of competition, which creates what he calls an explosive mixture of motives. And the major aspect is, of course, the self-exploitation of value, which is an increase in the ability to carry out the activity that is performed. And this increase, right, this self-exploitation of value as production of productivity is one of the many ways in which the modern mobilization loop begins to turn into movement. He says Marx was right, that he described the capital which circulates around as self-propagation, as a demiurgic processing magnitude, like a god from the outside, right, an external. And well, let me look up demiurge. Yeah, I just looked that up here. It's like understood as a creator of worlds. So we have here a similar idea that we find in Marx. And this is an external creator who fashions this particular world. And Sloterdijk criticizes that he has given too little attention to the kinetic foundational processes of modernity, and gives a critique that identifies too much external elements that are the main engine of these processes. Okay, we have reached the 25-minute mark. I didn't want to speak so long, actually, but it's sometimes hard to control. We have discussed a little Marx today. Look in the description box. I will have there some questions to maybe deepen the understanding of the book. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoy these study sessions, while I'm not an expert, right, then please subscribe, give it a like, and let's stay in contact, live long, and prosper by reading more Sloterdijk.